Welcome to the Migraine Miracle Moment. I'm your host, Dr. Josh Turknett. I'm a neurologist, migraine specialist, migraine sufferer, and author of the book, The Migraine Miracle. In this podcast, you'll learn all about how to find your path to migraine freedom without pills. Let's get started. Howdy, Bee Slayers. In today's episode, I will be answering 5 questions from a recent Clinic Chat live discussion. Those questions are: 1, can eating a keto diet cause fatty liver? 2, are herbal teas okay on the Migraine Miracle Program? 3, what are my thoughts on yogurt, milk, and sour cream? Number 4, when and how should you use MCT oil? And number 5, is quinoa okay on the Migraine Miracle Program? So those are the 5 questions that are addressed in this excerpt from a recent Clinic Chat live sessions. And if you're interested in taking part in these live sessions, as well as being able to submit questions of your own, and you can learn more about becoming a member by going to mymigrainemiracle.com, along with being able to attend all of our Clinic Chat live sessions and watch all of the replay videos of them. There's also a whole host of resources there that we've been developing for the past decade to help you put the Migraine Miracle Program into action to slay the beast once and for all. And speaking of Migraine Neverland members slaying the beast, we have a recent success to share from Migraine Neverland member Kelsey, who said, "I am ready to fly with my own 2 wings as I have been triptan-free for many months now and have a really good daily practice to keep the beast at bay," which I thank you so much for. Well, thank you, Kelsey, for sharing that with us. That is tremendous, and that is, of course, our ultimate goal with everyone we work with, is to get you ready to empower you to fly on your own into your migraine-free future. Also, there are a few things mentioned in this episode that you will find links to in the podcast description. One is a link to our phases quiz. So that's the phases in the timeline of migraine freedom, and you can take the quiz to find out which phase you are in. Another is the Keto Blast Challenge, which is a 30-day challenge we run periodically to help people implement the Keto for Migraine plan. And you can find more about that by going to mymigrainemiracle.com/Keto Blast to see when the next one is. And again, the link will be in the podcast description. Also, you can find the latest promotion for our podcast listeners by going to mymigrainemiracle.com/moment. Again, that link is in the podcast description as well. Speaking of podcast listeners, I'm going to read a recent podcast review. Again, this is our way of thanking our podcast listeners who we so appreciate, and especially those of you who take the time to leave a review. It really means a lot to us, and it helps others to find it. This one comes from Laura, who said, "I just started listening to Dr. Turknett's podcast after reading his book. This is a physician who truly understands migraine and its impact on his patients' lives. He's a beacon in the light of the storm." Well, thank you so much, Laura, for posting that. That really means a lot. All right, and now, without further delay, here is the excerpt from our recent Clinic Chat Live. All right, next question was, can eating a ketogenic diet cause fatty liver? So fatty liver, or the technical term, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, to distinguish from alcoholic fatty liver disease. So alcohol causes accumulation of fat in the liver. But we also have discovered that sugar causes accumulation of fat in the liver. So the good news is keto would typically cause precisely the opposite. So again, there's lots of evidence now that fatty liver, which is very, very common, and the incidence is rising, is driven by sugar consumption, and especially fructose in particular.
And it is best associated with high levels of triglycerides in the blood, which we also know to be driven primarily by dietary sugar content. So the best way to lower triglycerides is with a very low carbohydrate diet. So because of this, a ketogenic diet, of course, which is very low in carbohydrates, would be predicted to help with fatty liver disease. And in fact, it is now being used by folks to treat it. And there are studies that are showing it to be beneficial in helping not only prevent the condition, but help to reverse it. All right, only a couple more. Are herbal teas okay on the Migraine Miracle Program? And as a general rule, yes. Now, there are probably a great many different possible herbal teas, but so far in our experience, the ones that I know of haven't tend to be problematic. I would say the only caveat would be if you ever notice that a tea, upset your stomach in any way, then that might be a reason to, not use that particular one. But the difference, or the true teas that come from the tea plant, those can be problematic in my experience. So that's the main distinction. So things like black tea and green tea. But the herbal teas, which aren't actually true teas, those seem to be fine, and I drink them myself and do not notice any issues with them. How long before introducing milk back into the diet, and how about yogurt? So I generally don't recommend milk in the diet, and this actually gets back to the original question about things that I've updated. I probably wouldn't have said that 10 years ago. It gets back to the issue of energy density. Milk is very energy dense, and it's in liquid form, meaning we can ingest a ton of energy really fast, long before consume much more than we need before that registers as satiety. It's intended to support all the nutritional needs of a developing baby in liquid form, so that's why it's so nutrient and energy dense. While other forms of a dairy, I think, are fine, especially ones that have little to no milk sugars, I think it's probably best for adults to avoid consuming milk. And I would say definitely for the migraineur, since the issues with energy excess, but I probably would extend that to any adult. Probably best to avoid, drinking milk, at least on a regular basis. So in moderation may be fine. And then as far as yogurt goes, so full fat yogurt is probably okay, but would be something that I would typically recommend leaving to reintroduce until you're in stage or phase 3 or 4 on the timeline. Probably the safest bet. Any other questions?
There was one that got buried up a little higher about thoughts on sour cream versus yogurt.
Yogurt is going to be a little bit more insulinogenic than sour cream because it's going to have higher protein content. So that, plus the fact that you're typically going to be consuming less sour cream at a time than you would for yogurt, I probably put sour cream in a little bit safer category. But it's still something that, it is also something that's easy to eat in excess. So it's still something I'd probably is best to wait for stage 3 or phase 3 or 4, just for those reasons. But head to head versus yogurt, I would say a little bit less potential for any issues, mainly because of its effects on insulin. Eileen asked about still recommending MCT oil in coffee. So I mainly recommend that for the transitional period in MCT oil in general. The transitional period, I mean, going from if you're moving from a higher carbohydrate diet to a low carb or ketogenic, to help in dealing with the transitional symptoms while your body is trying to move towards burning fat for fuel. so it can help in that regard in minimizing the transitional symptoms. So yeah, Eileen, you said you're in phase 1. So if you're in phase 1, it would part of that will depend on how significant an issue the abortive meds are playing. So if you're kind of still trying to get over that hurdle, generally, I think it's best to kind of implement the core plan. And then, and we've talked about this before, waiting on specifically trying to go into keto until that's kind of been addressed and settled, and then kind of saving things like MCT oil. Yeah, so I would probably unless you're noticing significant transitional symptoms like a lot of fatigue from the transition, then I would avoid MCT oil until you're kind of going into until you're trying a dedicated trial of keto. Yeah, Eileen. Yeah, I would generally recommend being off of the abortives for a good bit of time. A month or so before for going to keto, just because we talked about before, the transition into keto is in itself a stressor. So when you're doing that, you don't want to be adding, another stressor onto something you're already doing, which is another stressor, which is trying to get your body off of or kind of recover from the impact of the abortive medications.
I would also insert here that doing the 30-day jumpstart menu is always a great place to start. It was built from the superfoods list, so you don't really have to think about any of these things. You're getting sort of our most protective foods that we've compiled, and then not having to worry about counting carbs and those sorts of things.
Stephen asked about any change of thought on quinoa. That requires I remember my initial thoughts. But no, I don't think so. I generally think of quinoa as a relatively good source of or a safe plant food, and reasonably high in protein. Especially compared to other plant foods. I don't have any specific reasons why I would avoid it. The only real issue with it would be, if you're mindful of carb content, then you'd have to just, note how much you're adding in if you're trying to maintain within keto range. But otherwise, I think overall, it's good from the standpoint of nutrient quality, and then minimal in terms of toxin issues. But that does get into the question of how of thinking about plant foods in general, and we know there are certain folks who do really well when you just, especially if having digestive issues, do well with just eliminating them all. Whether or not that's just good for certain populations or whether that would be considered the optimal for everyone, still an open question. I think it's, I'm still at a point where I think there's room to incorporate plant foods into the diet and be considered an optimal, an optimal plan. And there may well be phytochemicals, things we get from plant compounds that are health promoting that we couldn't get from elsewhere.
All right, thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Miracle Moment. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the podcast in your podcast player of choice. And if you know any fellow migraine sufferers, please feel free to share it with them as well. And now it's time to go out and slay the beast.